it's one of those years where, yeah, we've had some seasons in the past, right, where you could go 15 deep, and that from 8 to 12 could be anybody. It sure feels like there's like I said, a consensus kind of top 9, top 10. It's mainly just kind of about what order you want them in.
Thanks for listening to KC Sports Network, proudly presented by Emprise Bank. If you're thinking about starting a business or know someone who is, check out Emprise Bank's SBA loans. It's always good to know your options, and they can be your partner in possible.
Hello, and welcome back to the Verbal Commitment Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network, brought to you by Home Field Apparel. I'm Kevin Flaherty, and I'm here with Ryan Wallace from GoPowerCat.com and 24/7 Sports. And we're talking about the world of local recruiting, from Kansas and Kansas City prospects to the college classes at Kansas, Kansas State, and Missouri. We have a fun show for you tonight, talking about the Kansas in-state class of 2026, and we'll have our updated rankings on those players as recruiting in that class is quickly heating up. As always, if you like what you're hearing, tell your friends about us, subscribe, hit that like button, or leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts, like Apple or Spotify. All of those things help for us to grow the show and put us in front of more people like you. Ryan, transfer portal is slowing down just a little bit. We can catch our breath. But now, all of a sudden, here come junior days and sort of the first wave of commitments from high school juniors.
Yeah, I mean, this is the time that, like, we always talk about how coaches really don't get a break. If you have a successful season, or even if you don't, but let's say the successful seasons, you're going into bowl prep and you're trying to pick out your wife's Christmas gifts and, do all that stuff. And you're recruiting the transfer portal and you're trying to sign guys at the beginning of December. Then you get through with your bowl prep and you're trying to finish whatever transfer scraps are left. Then you're back out on the road, which we've seen from KU and K-State this week. And then you're coming back home to try and put together some sort of kind of early junior day. And if you're not doing junior day in January, you're trying to prepare for that and who you want to invite to campus, maybe for some spring practice visits in March. And then, winter conditioning is getting going. So, and there's that February signing day too, which I don't know who signs for that anymore, but there is that too. So yeah, I don't envy the job of coaches these days, Kevin.
As a pair of married people ourselves, we also know that, telling your wife that what you got her for Christmas is a wide receiver transfer, she's probably not going to take that one too well.
No.
All right. Well, speaking of commitments and sort of going into that, let's hit the alarm, Ryan. There it is. We will start with Kansas landing a commitment from Maize South defensive end Hunter Higgins on Wednesday. 24/7 Sports number 4 player in the state for 2026 picked the Jayhawks from a group of finalists that included Wisconsin, Michigan, and Nebraska. We had Hunter on the show recently, and Ryan, both of us were out to see him play in person this season. What do you think of the Jayhawks get here?
Well, first off, and I put this out on X, I tweeted it to Hunter, an amazing commitment from the standpoint of more kids need to embrace the vintage gear.
Yes.
The hat was amazing. And really all 4 of the finalist hats that he chose were kind of had a retro feel. What do you have? Like the starter jacket on there?
He did have the starter jacket. That was my favorite part of the ensemble. He got a lot of comments on the hat, but I was a big fan of the starter jacket.
Freaking love it. And KU should be really excited about this get. We won't spend a ton of time on Hunter because we have touched on him in previous shows. But again, kind of a guy that I think you trust has a baseline floor to come in and be ready from a physical standpoint. You and I both talk about how good we think he is against the run and how he can kind of anchor that edge. He mentioned on the last show, for him, it's just kind of getting back to the quick twitch and more of that speed that made him a recruit and a known commodity as a sophomore that maybe kind of got away a little bit from him junior year. I think he's primed for his senior year to get healthy, get faster, and really take off. And I like the get a lot for KU. I do. And again, it kind of continues this momentum that you and I kind of were predicting and kind of forewarning folks about. It's coming to fruition here in Lawrence.
Yeah, if you want to hear more from Hunter about his decision, I went down to Maize South High School and was there to ask him some questions, get a little bit more. You can see that on the Pay Heed podcast episode that we'll shoot tomorrow. He had some interesting things to say, not just about his commitment, but also about who he's targeting next. And Higgins became the fourth of our top 10 players in the 2026 Sunflower State class to commit. The third one to pick Kansas. Later in the show, we will reveal our top 10 and talk about the way some of those guys are maybe trending in their recruitment. Let's go ahead and hit another alarm real quick, Ryan.
There it is.
This one is portal related. Missouri has one of the top portal classes in the country, and the Tigers added their top ranked transfer so far in Georgia edge Damon Wilson. 24/7 Sports ranks Wilson as a 95 on its scale that goes to 100, making Wilson the nation's number 2 edge and number 5 overall player in the portal. Missouri's replacing a lot of players in that defensive end room, including Kansas City product Williams Waneri, who flipped over to Nebraska. And Ryan, the Tigers went out and got an even more highly rated player, at least at this point in his career, certainly a more productive player at this point than kind of what Missouri lost at that spot.
Great fit. I don't know what the Tigers had to pay to get him because there were some big time, programs that were involved. But a guy that I think was probably worth whatever they paid him because the fit is just so seamless. What Tiger fans saw from Johnny Walker at, I think what Missouri calls like a joker position, right? That you flip on the tape of Wilson and it's the same thing. I love the way that he can come off the edge. I love the way that he can stand up. He plays well against the run. He shows speed and pass rush ability. This is a no-brainer for me. And Kevin, it kind of reminds me a little bit different position, but kind of when they went out and got Hopper a couple years ago from Florida, it was like you knew that he was going to be good, right? There wasn't a lot of question marks about how that transition was going to go. Now you go out and you get Wilson for, again, the position fit that fits. He's got the experience. He's proven it in the SEC. This should be plug and play from day one with a lot of success.
Not a lot of projection here when you're talking about this one. And to your point, such a valuable position in the portal too, right? I mean, if you're looking at building out sort of that hierarchy, I know we talked, I think, heading into last year, how everybody kind of said, well, we're going to go get a starting left tackle in the portal. And you were thinking, well, everybody is looking for a starting left tackle in the portal. It felt like this year, especially with the quarterback class maybe being a little bit down from some of the quarterback transfers that we've seen in the past, it really felt like the two areas where you saw a lot of people just going crazy and try to fill up were at wide receiver, which obviously you can play a lot of those guys together. And so filling out your receiver room really became a difficult thing. And the other one is edge, people who can get after the quarterback, make their jobs really difficult. I'm right there with you. I mean, there's not really anything bad you can say about this one. You're getting a top 5 transfer in the country. You're getting a guy that fits incredibly well, that's already proven in your league, has played at the very highest level. And it wouldn't surprise me at all, Ryan, if he came in and had sack numbers right out of the gate. But the other thing about it too, with the type of athlete he is, I think he also gives them some versatility in that he is a guy that you can drop back a little bit if you wanted to run some zone blitzes or do some different things. The versatility is there, and I think the Tigers are going to have fun playing around with that one.
Yeah, I mean, at his size, like one of the clips that I was really impressed with was like him just kind of floating out into the flat and identifying kind of a pattern that was out to the running back in open space. And then he comes down and handles an open field tackle, at his size on a much smaller running back. Really, really impressed with him. And again, we talked about, I think last show or the show before, about kind of Missouri at the quarterback position and kind of, this is a better fit, right? I think there's fewer question marks. But in terms of bridging that gap, right, it allows Missouri's got some younger guys at the quarterback position, just like they have at the edge position. I'm thinking of a guy like Ja'Kai Lang that I think is a redshirt freshman. This gives him just maybe a little bit more time. I'm sure he's ready to get on the field. I'm sure Missouri wants, to get his feet a little bit more wet. But this allows you to not have to rush his progression. So, again, terrific get for the Tigers.
We're going to take a deeper look at the 2026 Kansas class after the break. But first, are you having trouble committing? Well, I'm here to tell you that it's easy to commit to landing a sweet piece of gear from your favorite team or Home Field Apparel. It's definitely sweater weather, and Home Field has some terrific knit sweaters to choose from, along with t-shirts, quarter zips, and all things vintage. Kansas State, and Missouri fans all have more than 40 items apiece to choose from, so head over to homefieldapparel.com and use the promo code link below in the description, and you can get 15% off your first order. We'll be right back.
Looking for tickets for your next event? Tickets for Less is your number one source. Save big on every purchase when you use promo code KCSN at ticketsforless.com.
Welcome back to the Verbal Commitment Podcast, sponsored by Home Field Apparel. Ryan and I ranked the top 5 in-state players for 2026 in August, heading into the high school season. We've seen some changes since then, but first, before we reveal those, let's take a look at those initial rankings. Great Bend's Ian Premer comes in at number 1. We were ahead of the curve on Manhattan safety, and now Kansas commit J.J. Dunnigan, ranking him at number 2. If you follow along regularly, you'll know we're still higher than the consensus there, at least until the rankings are updated here pretty soon. Mays South defensive end Hunter Higgins came in at number 3, followed by Derby offensive lineman Max Robinson, and rounding out our top 5 back in August was Wichita Northwest linebacker John Michael Fountain.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and
I'm ready.
right away. Let's move ahead to now mid-January after all of those players had their junior seasons, and there are a few changes. Yeah. Dunnigan moves to 1 for us, just ahead of Premer, but Ryan, I don't think we'd probably fight anybody who kept them 1, 2 in either order. We also flipped Robinson and Higgins at 3 and 4, and moved Free State offensive tackle Braden Wilmus to number 5. Wilmus committed to Clemson in December, expanding those rankings out to 10 now. Fountain won't have to wait long to hear his name called. He comes in at number 7 with Shawnee Heights wideout Tyron Parker, a player who could have as much upside as anyone in this class, coming in just ahead of him at number 6. Hot on Fountain's heels is the other elite linebacker in this in-state class, Lawrence's Josh Galbraith. And rounding out the top 10, our Kansas quarterback commitment, Jalen Mason, number 9. He's Fountain's Wichita Northwest teammate, and Salinas Central offensive tackle, Caden Snyder. All right, Ryan, now that we've made the reveal, where do you want to start?
Well, first off, I one thing that I thought about, like, as we were putting this together, and it wasn't something, again, kind of immediately on my mind when we were putting all the names out and listing different orders and whatnot. But, the more I started staring at that graphic, you won't see a lot of Kansas City names for, it's kind of interesting. Like, you've got 2 Free State and Lawrence with Galbraith and Wilmus. And there are players in the Kansas City area that we're aware of from on the Kansas side. But yeah, it's interesting the way that shook out, Kevin. You usually get 1 or 2. In the case of last year, you had Merritt and you had Richmond and you had Babalola and more. I mean, there were a bunch of guys that would have been continuing. Yeah, I mean, from the Kansas City area in our top 10. Just an interesting take that this class doesn't seem to feature any of them for us yet. But getting back to the top 10, though, we've talked at length about our top 2 guys. We mentioned about Hunter Higgins when we saw him against Max Robinson. So really our top 4, I feel like we've kind of discussed the pros and cons of those guys and given hopefully our regular listeners kind of an idea of why they are where they are. Where it got interesting, though, I think for you and I, and where we only differed really in 2 areas. Yeah. And one of them was, and again, it wasn't differences where you and I were ready to duke it out, like, rock, paper, scissoring or whatever for who's this, are we going to go here? Are we going to go here? We're not, these players that we're talking about, the difference is pretty interchangeable, right? So, but it came for the first instance came with Hunter Higgins and Braden Wilmus. Yep. And I'll take Wilmus to start, and then I'll let you kind of give your spiel about Hunter Higgins. I leaned Wilmus at 4. We end up slotting him at 5, which I think is fine. But for me, Kevin, you just don't find the offensive tackle frame that Braden Wilmus has every day growing on a tree. He's a legit 6'7". Some areas list him at 6'8". And I know the strength about him right now to me is the tenacity that he plays with. He's got a good motor. I think each day it seems like he's progressing more and more in his technique. The footwork for me too is impressive, because is he the most mobile guy in the world? No, that's probably one of the things that maybe he gets knocked on from a national perspective is, how well he moves. He's not, he plays basketball, but he's not that nimble on his feet, right? But like this play right here to me gives a great example of not only lateral quickness, but he doesn't seem to be struggling getting downfield to make that next level block to me, Kevin. So I've seen him in camp settings. We saw him in the fall. I know that he's more mobile and agile and athletic than I think maybe he's getting credit for from on a national standpoint. He strikes me, Kevin, as a kid that is on the up and up. It's like his sophomore year was kind of getting his feet wet. I think his junior year, he was still kind of working in some new faces beside him on that Free State offensive line and kind of building a little bit more of that connection there. I see him really taking off his senior year. And so for me, I just think that tackle position for him, he is what he is. Like with Higgins, for me, there's a little bit more of what is his fit going to be at the collegiate level in terms of a position. You don't have that question mark with Braden Wilmus. I'm fine if we want to have Higgins at 4. We do. But I do see maybe a little bit more of the upside and the ceiling with Wilmus.
Yeah, to your point, a coaching friend of ours was comparing and contrasting him with Calvin Clements, obviously another Lawrence Free State offensive lineman who's set to probably start at left tackle at Kansas this year. He thought Wilmus, to what you were saying, was more agile than Calvin Clements at the same stage. And so I think that's pretty high praise for somebody that is looking at a guy that, again, like the guy that you're saying is less agile is probably going to wind up starting potentially multiple seasons at left tackle at the Power 4 level. And so I do think Wilmus is more agile than maybe he gets credit for. Some of that I do think it probably is the frame, Brian, because it's tough to look agile when you're
Exactly.
that big. It's not the easiest thing, but no, I definitely see the point there. I think with Hunter Higgins, the reason that I had him at 4 and Wilmus 5, and to your point, like we literally just had those two flip flop. There wasn't a big gap, and to let the viewers know sort of the process behind this, you did your list, I did my list, we compared, we talked about it, and we made our list together. The reason I had Higgins ahead of Wilmus is I actually think Hunter Higgins has a lot that he didn't necessarily put on tape this year. And that's not necessarily to say that his tape was bad this year, but we know he was dealing with a back thing. He talked with us about it. Obviously, it's something his coach talked about too. But Ryan, you look at how big he is, the frame that he has, the ease at which he'll put on weight. And I think when you look at the hand usage, you saw there the rip move to kind of get through and make a play. I think that once he's fully healthy, you're going to see some of the things that you were talking about in that first segment. You're going to see more burst. You can already see that he thinks more than a lot of defensive ends do. He rushes with a plan, and he understands how to convert speed to power where, hey, I'm not quite getting this edge, but I can get inside, get my hand into a guy's chest and move him. I think the floor is incredibly high on Hunter Higgins. I think his floor may be about as high as anybody's in this class. Wilmus would probably have him beat on the ceiling, like to your point. Like if they both absolutely reach their, hey, this is the best version of Hunter Higgins, this is the best version of Braden Wilmus. The best version of Braden Wilmus is potentially, an NFL starting offensive tackle. Right. And so I think that it's tough. It's tough to beat that unless, as a defensive end, you're a guy that just is Micah Parsons, and you've got just twitch coming out of your ears. And so I definitely see that part of it. I do like Hunter in that spot in part because of his floor. I think that you're going to see more burst and more agility from him this year. But I also think the hand usage, the way the strength is going to play up, and we rank these guys without thinking of where they're going to school or their fit. It's where are these guys in a vacuum. But I do think that there's a strong fit for him at Kansas's strong side defensive end spot, because I think the level of twitch that he has is just fine for that spot, and he can do it while only weighing, 10 pounds, 15 pounds more than he does now. And that would be like Kansas's ideal. It's that frame fitting in there. And so, yeah, I really like Hunter Higgins at that 4 spot.
Well, and so then moving down from there, you and I are both on the same page when it comes to Tyron Parker. You mentioned it.
Love him. Yeah.
I mean, I think the ceiling for him, as you said, probably you could argue is as high as anybody in this class. He's just kind of sitting there. And again, a guy that I think just kind of got his feet wet this year. And that connection with Aiden Scott is just going to take off. I mean, when you lead the state, I think at least in the major big class in receiving yards, as just a junior, and this was kind of your first year truly having a full season to work with your quarterback, the sky is going to be the limit for Tyron Parker next year. So I think he's on the cusp of getting into that top 5. It could be sooner than later. And then you mentioned, John Michael Fountain, Galbraith. I think there are a lot of things that we like there. There's still some things that we'd like to see them kind of take that next step in terms of, with Galbraith, it's, maybe a position fit for him. And maybe you could make that same argument for Fountain, right? Of like, what are you? And let's see the game slow down a little bit for both those guys. We think it'll happen this year.
Yeah.
And then you get down to towards the bottom there, and we both were fine with Jalen Mason at 9. We're both in agreement that I think he's probably more of a crisp quarterback than he's being rated right now. Yeah, and I think the more time that he's working with Justin Hoover and spending more time working with other quarterbacks in the area, he's just going to grow. We've seen the progress that he's made at Wichita Northwest from his freshman year at Mays. But then you got down to the guy that I think for us is probably the most contentious right now, and it's Caden Snyder. And yeah. I'll let you lead here. Give us the take on why Caden Snyder makes our top 10.
Yeah, because I had Caden Snyder in, and you did not. And you talked about the lack of Kansas City guys. You actually had a Kansas City guy sneaking into. We'll get there, number 10 spot, and we'll get there in just a minute. Caden Snyder is a guy we are both lower on, I think, than the recruiting industry, and you'll see that later on here when we talk about that. I like the athleticism. There's so much to like about the athleticism. Caden Snyder, Ryan, can absolutely move.
Yeah, look at the mobility. Yeah.
Yeah, and so when you look at the agility, you can see why somebody who's watching the clips and watching that, and they see that, and they're like, "Oh, the feet, he's got some power to him." He does a nice job of sort of re-locking on guys because of that agility. He can get off balance and get back on balance because of his agility. The thing that I think we're a little bit lower on, Ryan, and this is going to sound bad, I don't mean for it to, because we like Caden Snyder. It just not necessarily as much as the recruiting consensus. I think the frame's a little bit further away than what people would think who aren't seeing him in person. And both of us have seen Caden in person multiple times. And so we've been able to see that. The one thing I will say too, if for whatever reason he can't get the weight up to where he is an offensive tackle, because you'd love to have that agility at left tackle. And if Caden Snyder can get up to 300 pounds and keep that agility, then absolutely, like, fantastic, move him up. I think he and Tyron Parker are two of the guys that I think both of us would agree that if things click are guys that could certainly move up. I also think that if for whatever reason Caden Snyder isn't able to add that weight, I think there's a possibility that you wind up with an agile 4-eye out of it if you move him over to the other side of the ball. And so I think that that's maybe where I'm a little bit higher than you are. I understand the question marks. You didn't have Snyder that much further down than I did. It was just kind of right there in that last spot. And I kind of nodded on, hey, if things click, then maybe Snyder's top 5. And I think you went with a guy that I believe is, maybe one of the more ready-made guys in terms of a guy that you would feel like could come in and find a spot on a Big 12 2 deep within a few years. And I guess that's the intro for you to take it away on your pick.
Well, and that, just to wrap up on Snyder, again, we talked about it on the show time and time again. When we're talking about evaluating players and ranking players, it's so much of that balance of like floor to ceiling. Yes. And again, if we were just going on upside, I think Caden Snyder makes this top 10 with ease, because you do put on the junior tape and you're like, man, this kid is moving, like the mobility and the footwork and everything's great. But I just think that there's still a lot of things that he's working on in terms of his hands and his balance. Some of the blocks that I saw on tape were a lot of times is the defensive lineman like being already off balance and not Caden really taking force of the situation and moving guys on his own. And I think some of that, to your point, has to do with the frame. And I think the more time he can spend, look, he's a multi-sport kid, which we love. And he's just, some of that you struggle putting on the weight. And I think the more he can get in the weight room, the more he can get his body collegiately ready by the time his senior year comes around, I think the better it will serve him in terms of once he steps on a campus, wherever that may be. For me, though, again, I looked at Caden, it was like, I see the upside, but like the floor is still really low for me. Well, who's ready right now? And I know he's not a tackle. I think in this day and age, everybody wants the tackle frame. Everybody wants 6'7" and this crazy length. But sometimes you find a kid like LaMarcus Barber at Mill Valley is just a bull in a china shop and is damn good at it. He's just the brute force on this kid. And I love, Joel Appleby in the highlights, man, they love to bring this guy on a pole and swing him and have Reggie Reese just say, find his back and follow him. You know what I mean? But the force that he plays with, here he is just forklifting Juju Marks. And regardless of what you think of Juju Marks, you know how big Juju Marks is. And Marcus Barber just lifted him and drove him back about 10 yards. The folks that I know, and here's a clip of him at defensive tackle, and you see him move with ease, right? Tracking down a guy like Braven Powell. And Mill Valley started to use him as a D tackle there. You talked about, if stuff doesn't work out for Caden Snyder at offensive tackle, maybe he can go to D-line. I think you could probably make the same argument about LaMarcus Barber. If you're not sold on him as an offensive guard for whatever reason, shoot, I'd try him at nose tackle. But Kevin, he's just a kid that I think is fine-tuning everything at a rapid pace. Comes to Mill Valley from Chapman, immediately kind of got thrown into the Wolves and had to adjust to, it's like when you go from a transfer portal from a small level school to a big level school, there's that speed transition. He did it with ease, and obviously at his size, it helps. It comes a little bit easier. But again, I thought watching him in week 1 and then flipping on his tape at the end of the year, this is a kid who's pretty polished as it is.
Yeah.
And again, you see the agility for a guy his size, but also a guy that understands balance from, the lower body and from his core. I believe there's a wrestling background or at least some powerlifting background to him. He's training with some guys in the area that from an offensive line perspective, we're really high on in terms of technical coaches. And I think college coaches are really starting to pick up on that. So for me, he was in the top 10. For us, he's slightly outside of the top 10, but a guy that I tell you what, the guys that made our top 10, LaMarcus Barber and some others, are knocking at the door. So we will be continuing to evaluate this through the offseason and into the season, because there are a lot of guys like LaMarcus that are going to be, again, like right there ready for somebody to slip up so they can get in there.
How good is that staff at Mill Valley, by the way? I mean, one of the things I think that we liked about Jaden Woods early on was some of the same stuff you're talking about in terms of Jaden Woods went from a guy where he would get a sack off of a spin move and look around like, did I do that? Like, is that allowed? Like, to a guy, who is confident and one of the most difficult defenders to deal with. And he got there pretty quickly over the course of a season. Barber, to your point, a guy that watching him in person in week 1, like we did, and then seeing him later in the year, it was obvious how far he came. And so credit to LaMarcus for that, but also credit to that Mill Valley staff for that. I had Barber just outside. I had him at 11. Other guys that we kind of talked about a little bit, Robert Hunter, Lawson McGraw, Nate Sims, another guy, kind of in that mix. There are a few other guys across the state that we really liked, but generally speaking, Ryan, we had a pretty close consensus. And one of the things that not to get mushy on you here or anything, but one of the things that I do like about you is I think we see guys fairly similarly, but we're also not afraid to disagree. And if there's a guy that one of us feels like getting on the table for, we're willing to do that. And so I think we came up with certainly I feel like a consensus top 11 or so, if not top 10. So
well, and real quick before I know we have something cool here on the other side that we can show, but you mentioned a couple other guys that were just outside the top 10. Folks, we are going to go. We're diving deep here in just the state of Kansas and in the metro. We'll get into the Missouri guys here in a little bit. Over the coming weeks, we're going to do deep dives positionally and some of those guys just as a whole that were kind of right outside our top 10. So, if you're itching for more, trust me, it's coming.
By the way, if you're curious, and this is what Ryan was just referring to, here's how our rankings stack up with the rest of the recruiting industry. Rest, Ryan, in kind of quotation marks, given that there's no ESPN here, given that ESPN has 4 players ranked.
Folks, if you go to ESPN right now, I think they have 4 kids. I don't even know if any of them are ranked. So we just left them out. For all intents and purposes, right now they suck. We don't sugarcoat stuff on this show, Kevin. ESPN sucks. At least at identifying Kansas in this neck of the woods. So we left them off, folks. You're not going to see
ESPN made enemies with me for life over Devin Neal. So Devin Neal, for those of you who don't know, was number 1 in the state everywhere but ESPN, who ranked him number 5. And I believe one of the guys ahead of him was somebody who didn't even play football in the state of Kansas. And Ryan, that's a nice transition to On Three's list, huh?
On 3, guys. You'll see the asterisk there next to Jack Fuchs. He doesn't live here anymore, guys.
Hasn't for a little while now.
Did not
play this high school season in the state of Kansas, so might want to update that.
Coach Fuchs took the job in the Tennessee Titans, and he's been playing at a school in Nashville, if I'm not mistaken, for the better part of the last year. So might want to update that. The other asterisk you'll see, and again, kudos to Rivals, because I think it shows that they're digging a little bit, is a guy that you talked about being outside of our top 10, but he cracked their top 10. That's Nate Sims, the wide receiver at Ottawa. Those are the only 2 guys that weren't featured on our list. Really the only ones that weren't featured across the board, but you get a good idea here. Again, we're really the outlier when it comes to Caden Snyder, and we discussed kind of why on that. But otherwise, it's the type of state year right now with 2026 in Kansas where it sure seems to me, Kevin, as you look across the board here, that across the industry, we have a pretty good feel for, you can say who the top 9 are, right? Or top 10 names. And I would imagine there's going to continue to be some fluctuation here amongst these 10, and maybe some of the guys that will boost themselves here this offseason and into the fall. But it's one of those years where, we've had some seasons in the past, right, where you could go 15 deep, and that from 8 to 12 could be anybody. It sure feels like there's like I said, a consensus kind of top 9, top 10. It's mainly just kind of about what order you want him in. And let me pitch it back to you by then transitioning here as we close the show. We open the show on Hunter Higgins.
Yeah.
As I just said, the top 10 is pretty kind of like what it is. And again, there might be some guys that we'll get to that could insert themselves into the top 10. But a lot of these guys, Kevin, have been kind of the top 10, top 5 for a while now.
Yes.
They're proven commodities. And when you start to think about what the Jayhawks are doing now, you got J.J. Dunnigan, you've got Hunter Higgins, you've got Jalen Mason, you've got 3 of our top 10, 2 of our top 5. Then you talk about the weekend that they have coming up, as this show will release just ahead of a massive junior day opportunity for the Kansas Jayhawks on campus on Saturday. I just got a notification that Tyron Parker is going to be there. Nate Sims is going to be there. Caden Snyder is going to be there. And oh yeah, the big gun, Ian Premer, will be there, flanked by Hunter Higgins and J.J. Dunnigan and Jalen Mason. Big opportunity for Kansas on Saturday to make a substantial impression on some of these guys. And it would not shock me. And I say this, folks, I'm looking at the camera. I don't have any inside knowledge here. This isn't me teasing anything. So Wally said, no, I don't know anything, but it wouldn't surprise me, Kevin, if another commitment comes out of this week. And it might not be an immediate one, but if, again, enough headway is made where between some of the guys that I just mentioned, you probably think maybe Snyder and Sims more than the other two. If another one comes off the table in favor of KU, and again, kind of a 2026 class that we said might be the year for Leipold.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Steve Wiltfong, who obviously both of us worked with at 24/7 and is now at On3, tweeted out the other day. He said Jayhawks are potentially making a move towards the top 25 class, and I was just kind of like, whoa. And obviously, we've seen the Louisianimals class where Kansas briefly had Jamar Chase, and had ranked to him. It was ranked in the top 10. But I think even when that was happening, there was some element of this doesn't feel real, right? Like Kansas is scooping up all these Louisiana commitments, some of whom had LSU offers and things like that. This probably isn't going to last. And when you looked at the end of the day, I think Kansas had 2 of those guys left in their final class. Ryan, this feels a little bit more sustainable when you look at, this is the advantage of them building some of these relationships within the state over the last few years. And look, like to your point, we were talking about this possibility, I feel like last fall, even where we were saying, and potentially even early last fall, where we were saying, hey, don't be surprised if this is a class that Kansas does really well in state with. And I think that when you look at sometimes the ball bounces in a way where you have 3 or 4 guys who grew up K-State fans and they're probably going K-State, and your class maybe trends a little bit more that way, no matter what KU does. KU can do everything perfectly. Still going to be tough to get Lincoln Cure. KU can recruit pretty well, but when you don't have the history or the background or different things like that, it's tough to beat K-State for Avery Johnson, and stuff like that. Kansas has had enough success now to where guys don't look at Kansas the way that they did 5 years ago. And even beyond that, now you're starting to see the staff's effort in building relationships with coaches, with these players. Some of these guys they've been recruiting for multiple years now. You're starting to see that pay off.
Yep. And again, with K-State, the 23 sounds like some of the members of the 2024 class from locally and even 2022 have become a foundation for where that program is right now. Is 2026 about to be a foundational class for Kansas? The pieces are there for it to be that, and we'll see if this momentum surge carries through. It has all the makings of being that in Lawrence.
We'll leave you with that. And thanks to all of you for watching and listening to the Verbal Commitment Podcast here on KCSN. If you like what you've seen or heard, leave us a like, subscribe, or hit us with a 5-star rating. And until next time even, we'll see you on the trail, and take care.